A police officer humiliates a girl and smashes her cell phone. But what he didn't know is that her father is Snoop Dogg himself. Write in the comments what you would do in this situation, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. The park basked under the warm embrace of a midday sun, its gentle light filtering through the canopy of trees that lined the neatly paved paths. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves, carrying the faint laughter of children playing tag near the swings. Families strolled by, some with dogs trotting happily beside them, others pushing strollers. It was the epitome of suburban serenity, where time seemed to slow down, and the world felt far removed from the chaos of city life. Nestled on a weathered wooden bench beneath a sprawling oak tree sat a 14-year-old girl, her attention entirely consumed by the sleek smartphone in her hands. She was dressed in simple yet neat attire: a pastel-colored t-shirt, a pair of faded jeans, and sneakers that had clearly seen a fair share of adventures. Her curly hair was tied back into a ponytail, though a few rebellious strands framed her face, catching the sunlight. Her dark brown skin glowed faintly under the dappled light, and her smile was one of quiet contentment as she tapped and swiped at the screen. The phone in her hands wasn't just a device, it was a gift. A recent birthday present from her father. The smartphone was a prized possession she treated with care. It wasn't the newest model on the market, but its smooth surface and polished edges gave it an air of sophistication. For her, it symbolized not only her father's love, but the countless sacrifices he had made to ensure she had everything she needed. It was a link to him, especially on days like today when he'd promised to meet her after his morning commitments. The girl, blissfully unaware of her surroundings, scrolled through her favorite app. The world around her melted away as she laughed softly at a funny meme and typed a quick reply to a friend's message. The park was her haven, a place where she could relax and enjoy the small pleasures of life while waiting for her dad. A few feet away, two squirrels darted up a tree, their tiny claws scratching against the bark as they chased each other in playful circles. Near the pond, ducks waddled lazily, their occasional quacks blending harmoniously with the murmur of the nearby stream. The occasional chirp of birds high in the branches added to the atmosphere of tranquility. It was a perfect day in every sense, but tranquility has a way of being fleeting. The low hum of an approaching vehicle broke the symphony of nature. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct, a subtle disruption in the park's harmonious rhythm. A police cruiser rolled into view, and its shiny black and white exterior gleaming under the sun. The tires crunched softly against the gravel as the car came to a halt near the park's entrance. At first, it seemed like a routine patrol, nothing out of the ordinary. The girl didn't notice the car at first, engrossed as she was in her phone. She had no reason to. After all, she wasn't doing anything unusual, just sitting on a bench in her favorite park, waiting for her dad. Yet, as the cruiser idled, its occupant took notice of her. From behind the tinted windshield, Officer Blake observed the scene. A man in his mid-40s with a square jaw and graying hair, Blake had been a police officer for over 2 decades. His uniform was crisp, his badge polished to a high sheen. To an outsider, he might have appeared as a picture of authority and respectability. But Blake's eyes, sharp and narrow, betrayed a different truth. They lingered too long on the girl sitting alone, their gaze filled with suspicion. Blake's hand rested on the steering wheel as he watched her, his lips curling into a slight frown. Something about her solitude, her age, the phone in her hands, didn't sit right with him. His thoughts churned as he tapped his fingers rhythmically against the wheel, his mind jumping to conclusions before facts could catch up. A young black girl with a smartphone, that nice? Sitting here alone? Waiting for trouble, maybe? Or already in it? The engine cut off, and the soft creak of the car door opening carried across the park. Blake stepped out, adjusting his utility belt as he surveyed the area. His boots crunched against the gravel as he took slow, deliberate steps toward the girl. His shadow stretched long on the path ahead of him, a stark contrast against the sunny day. Still absorbed in her phone, the girl remained blissfully unaware of his approach. Around her, the park carried on as usual. A dog barked in the distance, and a toddler squealed with delight as her father lifted her onto his shoulders. But for Blake, all of that faded into the background. His focus was singular, unyielding. As he drew closer, he took in the details. The slight tilt of her head as she concentrated on her screen, the faint smile playing on her lips, the relaxed posture of someone who felt safe. His frown deepened. That phone, its polished surface catching the light, became the center of his focus. The girl finally glanced up, sensing a presence nearby. Her expression shifted, curiosity replacing her earlier tranquility. Her gaze met Blake's, and for a moment there was a pause, a fleeting second of silent observation. She straightened slightly on the bench, instinctively clutching her phone a little tighter. "Nice day, isn't it?" Blake said, his voice even but carrying an edge she couldn't quite place. She nodded hesitantly, unsure of how to respond. Her heart began to beat just a little faster, though she couldn't say why. Something about the way he looked at her felt off. The peacefulness of the park seemed to dim slightly, as though a cloud had passed over the sun. Blake stopped a few feet away, his hands resting on his belt. His presence was imposing, deliberate. The girl offered a polite smile, hoping to diffuse whatever tension she felt creeping into the air. She didn't know it yet, but the serenity of her day was about to shatter. The stillness in the air shifted as Officer Blake planted his feet firmly in front of the girl, his shadow stretching across the bench. She looked up at him, her initial curiosity giving way to a quiet apprehension. His posture exuded authority, his hands resting firmly on his belt as if to emphasize the badge that gleamed in the sunlight. His gaze, however, was not one of simple curiosity. It was sharp, probing, and accusatory. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice carrying a weight that didn't match the casual question. The girl blinked, surprised by the directness of his tone. She tilted her head slightly, unsure why she was being approached. Her response was polite, her voice soft but clear. "I'm just waiting for my dad," she said, glancing briefly at her phone, as if it were a proof of her intentions. Blake's eyes flickered to the device in her hands, narrowing slightly. The polished surface of the phone seemed to capture his full attention, and the faint furrow in his brow deepened. He took a small step closer, his boots crunching against the gravel with deliberate weight. "That's quite the phone you've got there," he said, his tone laced with suspicion. "Mind telling me where you got it?" The girl's grip on the phone tightened instinctively, though her expression remained calm. She looked at him, confusion beginning to creep into her features. "It was a gift," she explained. "From my dad, for my birthday." Blake's lips twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile. It was closer to a sneer, one that carried no warmth or humor. He nodded slowly, as though considering her words, but the skepticism in his expression was unmistakable. "A gift, huh?" he said, his tone dripping with disbelief. "Must be nice to get something like that handed to you." The girl shifted uncomfortably on the bench, her body language reflecting her growing unease. She could feel the weight of his gaze, the way it lingered too long on her hands, on the phone. She wasn't sure what she had done to draw his attention, but his demeanor made it clear that he didn't believe her. "Do you live around here?" he asked, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. "Yes," she said, nodding. "Not far. My dad's coming to pick me up." Blake's eyes scanned the park as if searching for signs of the father she mentioned. The corners of his mouth twitched downward when he saw nothing that matched his expectations. He looked back at the girl, his expression hardening further. "This is a nice area," he said, his tone now unmistakably patronizing. "Not the kind of place where I'd expect trouble." The girl's eyes widened slightly at his words, the implication behind them landing heavily in her mind. She swallowed, her voice now tinged with a nervous edge. "I'm not causing trouble," she said quickly. "I'm just waiting." "Let me see that phone," Blake interrupted, his voice sharp and commanding. His hand extended slightly, a silent demand that brooked no argument. The girl froze, her heart pounding in her chest. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Blake's expression darkened. "Because I said so," he snapped. "If you've got nothing to hide, there shouldn't be a problem." The girl hesitated, her mind racing. She knew she hadn't done anything wrong, but the intensity of his gaze and the authority in his voice made her feel small, powerless. She clutched the phone tighter, instinctively protecting it. "It's my phone," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I didn't do anything wrong." Blake took another step closer, his imposing figure towering over her. His presence was suffocating, his shadow casting a chill despite the warmth of the day. "I'm not going to ask again," he said, his tone low and menacing. The girl looked around, hoping someone might intervene, but the few people who had noticed the exchange were keeping their distance. Some glanced their way briefly. Others turned their attention elsewhere, unwilling to get involved. "You think I'm playing games here?" Blake barked, his voice rising. The sharpness of his words made her flinch. "Hand it over." Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She took a deep breath, summoning what little courage she had left. "I'm just waiting for my dad," she repeated, her voice shaken but firm. Blake sneered, his patience clearly wearing thin. His hand twitched as if he were about to grab the phone himself. "Kids like you think you can just do whatever you want," he muttered, the venom in his words unmistakable. "Walking around with things you don't deserve." The words cut deeper than the girl expected. She stared at him, her lips trembling as she tried to process the injustice of the moment. She hadn't done anything wrong, hadn't said or done anything to provoke him, and yet, here she was, being treated like a criminal for simply existing. Blake leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You don't belong here," he said, "and I'm going to make sure you remember that." Her hands trembled as she clutched her phone, her mind screaming at her to do something, anything. But the weight of his authority, the badge on his chest, and the threat in his voice left her frozen in place. The idyllic peace of the park had vanished entirely, replaced by an oppressive tension that pressed down on her chest. The girl didn't know it yet, but this moment was the tipping point. The confrontation was far from over, and the consequences would ripple far beyond the boundaries of the park. The air around her felt heavy, suffocating. The girl's hands trembled as she clutched the phone, the device now feeling less like a lifeline and more like a fragile piece of glass she couldn't afford to drop. Officer Blake's presence loomed over her, his shadow stretching across the bench, a visual reminder of the power imbalance between them. Her heart pounded in her chest, the sound almost drowning out the rustle of leaves and distant chatter of park-goers. "I'm just waiting for my dad," she repeated softly, her voice trembling. She had never felt so vulnerable, so exposed. The calm serenity of the park, her sanctuary, was now a distant memory. Blake's expression hardened, his eyes narrowing into slits. "I've heard enough of that," he snapped, his tone sharp and unforgiving. "Hand over the phone. Now." Tears welled in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She was scared, terrified even, but somewhere deep inside her a spark of defiance flickered. She knew she hadn't done anything wrong. She had every right to sit on this bench, every right to hold her phone without fear of it being snatched away. That knowledge, though small, gave her just enough strength to act. With shaking fingers, she unlocked her phone and quickly opened her contacts. Her father's name was at the top of the list, Dad. She tapped it, the screen glowing faintly in the midday sun as the call began to connect. Her breath hitched as the first ring echoed in her ear. "Who are you calling?" Blake demanded, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. His tone was no longer just harsh. It was laced with a growing impatience, a simmering anger that made the girl's stomach twist. "My dad," she managed to say, her voice small but steady. She clutched the phone to her ear, praying he would pick up quickly. The phone rang once, then twice. She could feel the tension radiating off Blake as he stepped even closer, his boots crunching against the gravel path. The call clicked, and just as her father's deep, familiar voice came through the line, Blake acted. Before she could get a word out, Blake's hand shot out like a snake striking its prey. His fingers closed around the phone with a force that made her gasp. "Enough of this," he growled, yanking it from her grasp. "No!" she cried, her voice breaking as she instinctively reached for the phone. But Blake stepped back, holding it out of her reach. His expression was one of cold disdain, his lips curling into a sneer. The phone still glowed faintly in his hand, the call to her father active. She could hear her dad's voice faintly through the speaker. "Hello, sweetheart, are you there?" The sound was muffled but unmistakable, a lifeline just out of reach. Blake glanced at the screen and, with a look of cruel satisfaction, turned the phone over in his hand. "You kids think you can do whatever you want," he muttered under his breath, though the words were loud enough for her to hear. "Maybe this will teach you some respect." And then, with a sudden, violent motion, he hurled the phone to the ground. The crack of plastic and glass shattering against the pavement echoed through the park like a gunshot. The girl let out a small, involuntary cry, her hands flying to her mouth as she stared at the broken pieces of what had been her most prized possession. Her father's voice cut off abruptly, replaced by silence. Blake's expression didn't waver. If anything, he seemed almost satisfied with himself. "There," he said, his tone dripping with contempt. "Let's see you call anyone now." The girl's knees buckled slightly, and she sank back onto the bench, her chest heaving with shallow breaths. Her eyes darted to the shards of her phone scattered across the ground, then back to Blake. Tears streamed down her cheeks now, unstoppable, as a weight of what had just happened crashed over her. The bystanders who had been watching from a distance now stood frozen, their phones raised to record the scene. Some looked horrified, others hesitant, as if unsure whether to intervene. The atmosphere in the park had shifted completely, the peaceful tranquility replaced by a heavy, uncomfortable silence. Blake glanced around, noticing the growing crowd. His jaw tightened, but he didn't back down. Instead, he turned his gaze back to the girl, his expression cold and unyielding. "Maybe next time you'll think twice before trying to pull a stunt like that," he said, his voice low and cutting. The girl didn't respond. Her hands shook as she wiped at her tears, her mind racing. Her father, he would know something was wrong. He had heard enough before the call was cut off. He would come. She clung to that thought like a lifeline, the only thing keeping her from breaking completely. Minutes felt like hours as she sat there, her gaze fixed on the shattered remains of her phone. Blake stood a few feet away, his posture stiff, his expression unreadable. The crowd continued to watch, murmurs rippling through the group as the tension in the air grew thicker. And then, a sound broke through the uneasy quiet, the low, rumbling growl of an approaching engine. It was deep, powerful, and growing louder by the second. The girl's head snapped up, her tear-streaked face lighting up with a flicker of hope. She knew that sound. Her father had arrived. The low growl of the engine grew louder, reverberating through the park like the rumble of an approaching storm. Heads turned in the direction of the sound, curiosity and anticipation rippling through the gathered crowd. Moments later, a sleek black SUV emerged from the tree-lined path, its glossy exterior glinting under the sunlight. The vehicle came to a smooth but decisive stop at the edge of the park, its presence commanding immediate attention. The girl's heart leapt in her chest, a mixture of relief and anticipation flooding her as the driver's door swung open. Out stepped her father, D.O.G.G. himself, Snoop Dogg. His tall frame and unmistakable swagger were instantly recognizable. He wore a crisp white shirt, dark jeans, and a pair of clean sneakers, his signature chains gleaming in the sunlight. His presence alone seemed to shift the atmosphere, the tension in the air thickening as everyone turned to watch. Snoop paused for a moment, surveying the scene with a calm intensity. His sharp eyes moved from the crowd to the shattered phone on the ground, then to his daughter. She was sitting on the bench, her face streaked with tears, her body slumped as though the weight of the world had been placed on her small shoulders. His gaze softened slightly when it landed on her, but only for a moment. It was quickly replaced by something harder, something fierce. With deliberate steps, he strode toward her, each movement exuding a quiet authority that silenced the murmurs of the onlookers. His towering frame and steady demeanor made him appear larger than life, a force of nature descending on the park. The closer he got, the more apparent it became that this was not just a father coming to comfort his child. This was a reckoning. "Daddy," the girl whispered, her voice trembling as she looked up at him. Her tears flowed freely now, her small frame trembling with a mixture of fear and relief. Snoop's expression softened again as he crouched down in front of her, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "I'm here, baby girl," he said, his voice low and steady, carrying an undercurrent of barely contained fury. He glanced down at the broken phone on the ground, his jaw tightening as he pieced together what had happened. He rose slowly, his attention shifting to the man standing a few feet away. Officer Blake had been watching the scene unfold, his earlier confidence faltering as soon as he recognized who had arrived. His posture stiffened, and he adjusted his belt awkwardly, his hands fidgeting at his sides. Snoop turned to face him fully, his calm demeanor masking the storm brewing beneath. "You the one who did this?" he asked, his voice even but carrying a weight that demanded an answer. Blake hesitated, his eyes darting nervously between Snoop and the crowd. He cleared his throat, attempting to regain some semblance of authority. "The girl was acting suspicious," he said, his tone defensive. "I was doing my job." Snoop's brow furrowed and he took a step closer. The sheer force of his presence made Blake flinch. "Your job, huh?" Snoop repeated, his voice dripping with controlled anger. So, your job is to harass little girls sitting on a park bench? To destroy their property? That's how you protect and serve? Blake's face reddened, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to form a response. He glanced around, realizing that the eyes of the entire park were now fixed on him. Some were recording on their phones, capturing every word, every movement. The realization only seemed to heighten his discomfort. I was following protocol," Blake stammered, his earlier bravado now replaced by unease. "She wouldn't cooperate. I had to—" Snoop cut him off with a sharp laugh, a sound devoid of humor. "Protocol?" he said, his voice rising slightly. "You telling me protocol is snatching a phone out of a kid's hands and smashing it to pieces? That protocol?" Blake took a step back, his confidence crumbling under Snoop's unwavering gaze. "Look, I didn't mean—" "Don't," Snoop interrupted, his tone cold and final. "Don't even try it." He gestured to the broken phone on the ground, his voice gaining momentum as he addressed not just Blake, but the crowd. "This right here, this ain't just a phone. This was a gift from me to my daughter, something I worked hard to give her. And you," he pointed at Blake, his fingers steady, "you decided it was okay to take that from her, to humiliate her, to make her feel like she didn't belong here. All because of what? Because of the color of her skin? Because she didn't bow down to you?" The crowd murmured in agreement, the tension in the air shifting. Blake's face had gone pale, his earlier authority reduced to a feeble shell. He looked toward the park's entrance as if hoping for reinforcements, but none came. He was alone, and the reality of his actions was closing in on him. Snoop stepped even closer, his voice dropping to a low growl. "You messed with the wrong family, homie. You think you can just bully kids and walk away like it's nothing? Nah, that's not how this is going down." At that moment, another sound broke through the tension, the wail of approaching sirens. Snoop had called his lawyers on the drive over, and they'd wasted no time escalating the situation. A second police car pulled up alongside the first, and out stepped a commanding officer, Captain Rodriguez, a tall woman with a stern expression. She walked with purpose, her sharp eyes taking in the scene as she approached. "Mr. Broaddus," she said, addressing Snoop with professional respect, "we've been informed about the situation." Snoop crossed his arms, his gaze never leaving Blake. "You better believe there's a situation," he said. "Your boy over there just harassed my daughter, destroyed her phone, and tried to act like it's no big deal." Rodriguez turned her attention to Blake, her expression hardening. "Officer Blake," she said sharply. "Is this true?" Blake stammered, his voice weak. I thought she was acting suspicious. I didn't mean—" "Enough," Rodriguez snapped, her tone leaving no room for argument. She gestured to another officer who had arrived. "Take his badge and gun. He's suspended pending an investigation." Blake's face crumpled as the other officer stepped forward, removing his badge and weapon with practiced efficiency. He opened his mouth to protest but quickly closed it, the weight of his actions sinking in. Snoop watched the scene unfold, his expression unreadable. He glanced down at his daughter, who had risen from the bench to stand beside him. He placed a protective arm around her shoulders, his grip firm but reassuring. "This ain't over," Snoop said, his voice low but resolute. "You're replacing that phone, and you're going to answer for what you did." Rodriguez nodded solemnly. "You have my word, Mr. Broaddus. We'll handle this." As Blake was led away, the crowd erupted into applause and cheers, their voices rising in support of the girl and her father. But Snoop didn't celebrate. He turned to his daughter, his expression softening as he looked at her tear-streaked face. "Let's go, baby girl," he said gently. "We're going to get you a new phone." Together, they walked back to the SUV, leaving behind the shattered remains of the phone and the echoes of justice served. As Snoop and his daughter approached the SUV, the cheers and murmurs of the crowd still echoed behind them. The shattered remnants of the phone lay forgotten on the gravel, a stark reminder of what had transpired. But for Snoop, this wasn't over. Not yet. Justice had only begun to take its course. He paused near the vehicle, his hand still resting protectively on his daughter's shoulder. She looked up at him, her face streaked with tears, but now laced with a flicker of hope. Her father had arrived, and in his presence the fear and helplessness that had consumed her moments ago began to dissipate. "Stay here for a minute, baby," he said softly, his voice calm but firm. "I got one more thing to take care of." She nodded silently, wiping at her cheeks as she climbed into the SUV. The tinted windows offered her a shield from the stares of the crowd, but she kept her gaze on her father. She knew he wasn't the type to let things slide. Snoop turned back toward the scene, his expression hardening as he walked with deliberate purpose. The crowd, sensing that something more was about to unfold, parted to give him a clear path. Officer Blake, who had been reluctantly lingering by the second police car, looked up as Snoop approached. His face was pale, a sheen of sweat glistening on his brow. He was no longer the commanding figure who had loomed over the girl earlier. Now, he looked like a man who had lost control of everything. Snoop stopped a few feet away, crossing his arms over his chest. His towering presence and unflinching gaze made the distance between them feel smaller, the space charged with tension. Captain Rodriguez stood nearby, watching intently but saying nothing, allowing the moment to play out. "You still standing here like you got something to say," Snoop began, his voice low and steady, the calm before a storm. "Go ahead, Blake. Explain to me. Explain to everyone what made you think it was okay to do what you did." Blake shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to Rodriguez as if seeking backup, but her stern expression gave him no solace. His mouth opened, but the words didn't come immediately, as though he were choking on them. "I was doing my job," Blake finally managed to say, his voice shaky. "She was acting suspicious. I thought the phone might have been stolen." Snoop let out a sharp, humorless laugh, his arms dropping to his sides as he took a step closer. "Suspicious?" he repeated, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Sitting on a bench, minding her own business, waiting for her dad. That's what you call suspicious?" Blake swallowed hard, his gaze dropping to the ground. "I didn't mean to—" "Don't," Snoop interrupted sharply, his voice rising. "Don't even try to spin this. You saw a young black girl with a nice phone, and you made up your mind right then and there. You decided she didn't belong. You decided she wasn't worthy of respect. And when she didn't jump at your command, you smashed her phone. You humiliated her. For what?" Blake's shoulders slumped, the weight of Snoop's words bearing down on him. The crowd murmured in agreement, their voices growing louder as the tension reached its peak. "You're supposed to protect and serve," Snoop continued, his voice booming now, "not harass and destroy. You think a badge gives you the right to treat people like that? To treat my daughter like that?" He shook his head, his eyes narrowing. "Not today." Rodriguez stepped forward, her voice steady and authoritative. "Officer Blake, you've been suspended pending an investigation. I'll be overseeing this personally, she said, her tone making it clear that this was non-negotiable. "And I assure you, Mr. Broaddus, he will be held accountable." Snoop nodded slightly, his jaw still tight with anger. "Good," he said simply, "but this ain't just about him. This is about what happens next. What you do to make sure this doesn't happen again." Rodriguez met his gaze, her expression softening slightly. "Understood," she replied, "and I'll make sure to follow up with you directly." With that, she motioned to the officers nearby, and Blake was escorted to the waiting cruiser. His head hung low, his earlier arrogance completely stripped away. The sight of it brought a small measure of satisfaction to the crowd, but Snoop wasn't here for a spectacle. He was here for his daughter. As the crowd began to disperse, Snoop turned and walked back to the SUV. His steps were slower now, the adrenaline from the confrontation starting to wane. He opened the door and climbed into the driver's seat, glancing at his daughter in the rearview mirror. She looked up at him, her eyes still red but filled with gratitude. "You okay, baby girl?" he asked, his voice softening. She nodded, a small smile breaking through the lingering sadness. "I am now?" she said quietly. Snoop reached back, gently patting her knee. "Let's go get you a new phone," he said with a small grin. "And don't worry, we're going to make sure everyone knows what went down today." He started the engine, the SUV pulling away from the park as the sun dipped lower in the sky. For Snoop and his daughter, the day had been a harsh reminder of the world's injustices, but it was also a testament to the power of standing up, of fighting back, and of never letting fear silence the truth. As the park faded into the distance, the weight of what had happened lingered, but so did the promise of change. The sleek black SUV pulled into the parking lot of a nearby electronics store, its engine humming softly before falling silent. The evening sun cast long shadows across the asphalt, painting the scene in warm hues. Snoop stepped out first, his tall frame immediately catching the attention of passers-by. Whispers rippled through the crowd, some reaching for their phones to take photos, but his focus remained entirely on his daughter. She climbed out after him, her movements still hesitant, her emotions a mix of lingering sadness and tentative relief. Snoop placed a comforting hand on her shoulder as they walked toward the store entrance. His touch was steady, reassuring, a silent promise that she wasn't alone. Inside, the bright lights and rows of gleaming electronics created a stark contrast to the events of the day. The girl's eyes widened slightly as she took in the display of phones, tablets, and gadgets. Normally, this kind of setting would have excited her, but the weight of what had happened earlier still hung over her like a shadow. A young salesperson approached them, their face lighting up in recognition. "Mr. Broaddus," they said with a polite smile, "it's an honor to have you here. How can I help you today?" Snoop nodded in acknowledgement, his demeanor calm but firm. "We need a phone," he said, glancing at his daughter. "The best one you've got, top of the line." The salesperson blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the intensity in his voice. "Of course," they said quickly, gesturing towards the latest models displayed in a glass case. "Right this way." As they walked, Snoop's daughter glanced up at him, her lips parting as if to protest. "Daddy, it doesn't have to be—" He cut her off gently, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "It's not about the phone, baby girl," he said. "It's about making sure you know your worth. You deserve the best." The words settled over her like a warm blanket, her heart swelling with gratitude. She stayed close to him as they approached the display case, her fingers brushing against his arm. The salesperson unlocked the case, carefully removing one of the newest models. The phone was sleek and elegant, its features top-notch. "This is our latest release," they explained. "It's got everything you could want: great camera, fast processor, long battery life." Snoop glanced at his daughter, silently asking for her approval. She hesitated, then nodded, a small smile breaking through her otherwise subdued expression. "This one," Snoop said, pulling out his wallet without a second thought. "We'll take it." The transaction was quick, and the salesperson handed over the phone, still in its box. As they walked back toward the SUV, Snoop handed the box to his daughter, his smile widening. "Go on," he said. "Open it up." She carefully unwrapped the packaging, her hands steady for the first time that day. The phone gleamed in the evening light, its surface smooth and pristine. Her fingers brushed over it, and for the first time since the incident, she let out a genuine laugh. "Thank you, Daddy," she said softly, looking up at him with eyes full of gratitude. Snoop's expression softened, and he knelt slightly to meet her gaze. "You don't have to thank me, baby girl," he said. "I'm your dad. I'm always going to have your back." They climbed back into the SUV, the mood inside lighter now. As they drove home, the girl busied herself setting up the new phone, her laughter filling the car as Snoop made corny jokes about how she better keep this one out of trouble. It was a moment of normalcy, of healing, after a day that had threatened to strip it away. Meanwhile, the events of the park continued to ripple outward. The videos recorded by onlookers had already begun circulating online, gaining traction across social media platforms. The hashtags #Justice for her and #StandWithSnoop trended within hours, sparking widespread outrage and discussions about systemic racism and abuse of power. By the time they reached home, the world had taken notice. News outlets picked up the story, and public pressure mounted for accountability. Captain Rodriguez, true to her word, issued a statement confirming that Officer Blake had been suspended and that a full investigation was underway. Snoop and his daughter sat together on the couch, scrolling through their phones as messages of support poured in. Fans, activists, and strangers alike flooded their feeds with encouragement and solidarity. The girl's smile grew wider with each message she read, her confidence slowly rebuilding. Snoop leaned back, his arm draped casually over the back of the couch. "You see, baby?" he said, his tone both proud and serious. "When you stand up for yourself, you don't just make a change for you. You make a change for everyone." She looked up at him, her eyes shining with admiration. "I'm glad you were there," she said. "I didn't know what to do." He shook his head, his expression softening. "You did exactly what you were supposed to. You called me, and when you can't handle something on your own, that's what I'm here for." As the evening stretched on, the two of them laughed and talked, the weight of the day slowly lifting. And though the shattered phone in the park had been left behind, the lessons it represented would stay with them forever. Justice, Snoop knew, wasn't always swift, but with enough determination the truth would always find its way to the light. For now, though, he was content knowing that his daughter was safe, her smile restored and her spirit unbroken. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories and share this video with your friends to spread the message. Check out our channel for more videos you'll love, and stay tuned for what's coming next.